their impact on land and water resources through sustainable use. And so the topic of urbanization helps us zero in on both of those enduring understandings. So please read section 10.5, pages 287 through 294. Okay, I believe we have seen a graph similar to this. This is showing the trend in where global populations live between 1950 projected through 2030. We hit that 50% mark in just before 2010, where half of the global population lives in urban areas, half in rural areas. And since then, that urban population has taken over the vast majority of global population increase will be in and around urban areas. Developed countries have been majority urban for quite some time. It's the developing world that is becoming increasingly urban. Okay, so what I want you guys to think about as we go through this set of notes is the trend. So is the fact that more and more people are living in these urban areas, is that something that is beneficial or detrimental with regard to our goal of living within the Earth's means to indefinitely provide and replenish the goods and services we need? Does it make that target easier or does it make it harder? Okay, so let's first talk about some important APES-specific topics about how urban areas differ from natural areas. Now, again, going beyond the very obvious. So let's talk about carbon cycle. So obviously, with more areas of concrete, paved surfaces and buildings, increased built environment, less natural environment. So there's obviously going to be less carbon removed from the atmosphere because of less photosynthesis. Now, to counteract that balance even more, there's an increased carbon output because of energy. So lots of motor vehicles, lots of heating of buildings, lots of industry increases carbon output. So our balance is going to be a big arrow out and maybe a smaller arrow in terms of our urban areas. Okay, so more vehicles, increased energy needs, more commuting from the suburbs. We'll talk about that nasty trend of urban sprawl here in a little bit. Okay, now let's go to the hydrologic cycle changes. So again, let's compare and contrast our natural environment to a built environment. Natural environment, so of the precipitation that falls onto the ground. In our natural environment, approximately 40% of that becomes evaporated off the surface, or plants take it up and then transpire it back out to the atmosphere. 10% of that liquid water becomes surface runoff, and about 50% percolates into the ground and works to recharge our groundwater and aquifers. Okay? Now, in the built environment, again, we have, let's say, the same amount of precipitation. 25% of that becomes evaporation or transpiration because of much fewer plants. 43% of that is surface runoff. That means it stays at the surface and goes into storm drains and eventually out to streams. So one of the things that can lead to is increased flooding and heavy rain events. Okay, and only 32% of that works its way down into the aquifer. So the big change in our built environment is the fact that so much more water stays at the surface and becomes runoff. Now, of course, it's running off over parking lots and roads and lawns and picks up all kinds of stuff. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about land use patterns and habitats. So obviously, the built environment is going to fragment wildlife. Can encroach on essential habitats like wetlands, forests, and desert. There are what are called brownfields. So brownfields are urban areas of abandoned like industrial lots. So what they leave behind sometimes is derelict buildings, or even if the buildings have been torn down, they're leaving behind maybe really contaminated soil. And there's sort of this little ongoing environmental mess that it makes the land basically unusable without some sort of restoration. So brownfields create an issue. It's really difficult for nature to come back and reclaim these little abandoned lots. Okay, and then of course we have those impervious surfaces. Impervious means it does not let water through, by the way. And urban runoff, it gets discharged into waterways. So like I just mentioned, as that water hits these surfaces on a parking lot, for example, there is probably a little bit of leaked motor oil or engine coolant. In and around grassy areas, I guarantee there, if it's a park or a school, they're probably using fertilizers and herbicides to keep their grass nice and green, kill off the weeds. All this stuff gets picked up by this runoff, and rather than going through the soil, where bacteria and fungus and things like that can break those materials down, they end up straight into our streams. Okay, so some other environmental issues with urban areas. Often, because people choose to live outside the city and work in the city, we have long commutes. And again, we will talk about urban sprawl here in a minute. So we get really traffic congested streets. And because of that, we get a buildup of air pollutants. So respiratory issues become a problem in urban areas. Noise and light pollution, those can both affect sleep and stress levels, which can actually go back all the way back to impact people's health. And there's an interesting phenomenon called the urban heat island effect. So basically, what happens with the urban heat island effect is our concrete and paved surfaces actually are able to absorb and retain more solar energy than a grassy or forested area. And so in urban areas, we actually get an increase in temperatures because of that greater absorption of solar energy. And that can exacerbate things like heat waves and also lead to the buildup of pollutants. Okay. So for example, if we looked at kind of like our rural area surroundings compared to the urban area, we can see sometimes a 3 to 4 degree Celsius, which is probably a 5 to 7 degree Fahrenheit increase in temperature in the downtown area compared to the rural surroundings. Okay, now I'm going to leave you guys with a discussion of this idea of urban sprawl. So, it's sort of this American dream, if you will, to have the house and the yard in a nice, safe neighborhood with sidewalks where kids can ride their bikes, and you can have backyard barbecues, and we cut down on noise. And often in these areas, we have lower crime rates compared to the more urban counterparts. Okay, but lots of the employment opportunities are in the city, and what that's created, particularly in the cities that have been built after the onset of the personal automobile, is this idea of urban sprawl. So basically, it is the change in population distribution of our urban areas, right? So the people that live near or work in a city, right, out to the suburbs to live, so they can kind of have a quiet place of respite. Like I said, the yard, lower crime rates, less noise, less light pollution, less air pollution, all these things. There's all kinds of reasons why people might choose to live out in the suburbs, more space, etc. Okay. Now, environmentally speaking, this has wreaked havoc because a lot of the things we talked about in terms of environmental issues with cities is this idea of air pollution. And with the urban sprawl comes really long commutes. So the picture you guys are seeing is rush hour traffic. It looks like morning hours, and lots of people from the suburbs are driving into the city for work that day. And if you look at the air quality, that's not just regular old fog. That brownish orange haze is something called photochemical smog, which is a photocatalyzed reaction with air pollutants that creates this haze. Okay, so with increased commutes comes increased air pollutants. And because we are spreading out into this urban sprawl, that increases land use, fragments even more habitat. And there's also some human health issues. So people get out of the city. One of the reasons they might choose to is less things like air pollution, which you might think would have a positive influence on health. But when you're spending that much time in a car, that much time commuting, stress level goes up. You're sitting down a lot more. And a lot of people decide to grab food to go just because of the long commutes and the long workday. They're not finding time to cook nutritious meals. And so a lot of fast food, takeout food creates this idea of commuter diet, which is often really high in things like sodium and saturated fats and stuff like that. So there's a lot of changes that are not positive that come from this idea of urban sprawl, right? And a really interesting graph. This was actually given on an FRQ one time for environmental science. Is if we look at the density. Okay, so the number of people per hectare in this case. So instead of people per square mile, it's per hectare, right? Really, and then we compare that to the energy footprint. So in this case, that would be petroleum use. So petroleum is just a synonym for oil. I know we haven't done Unit 6 yet. So we're talking about mostly for transportation, so gasoline and diesel. Okay. Now, what this graph tells us is that generally speaking, if we increase the density of a city, there is a corresponding decrease in energy use, particularly for transport. Okay. And so we can look at cities like Los Angeles and Houston. Okay. Now, relatively new-ish cities in the sense that they were built with the personal automobile in mind. So this idea of living in the suburbs, working in the city, this idea of being able to drive and get places quickly is how that city was built. So with a low density, you'll see that the per capita, that's per person, petroleum use goes way up. And if we go with much more dense cities, so notice New York, for example, right? Still not super dense globally, but it is an older city and much more compact in nature. Part of that is geographic. Part of that is how old the city is, built before the personal automobile came into play. We can, even a place like New York, which also in the United States has a much lower per capita petroleum use footprint because people walk and take subways and things like that. If we go to even older cities like Paris and London, and super dense cities like Tokyo and Hong Kong, we can see that trend continues. Okay, so again, going back to that initial question, cities do provide their own set of environmental issues, but they also provide their own set of environmental solutions. We're going to talk much more about those sustainable and innovative opportunities that dense urban areas can provide in class. I will see you then.